My name is Amanda Anderson. I'm the director of the Kogut Center for the Humanities here at Brown. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today for what promises to be a really exciting event. Back in the fall, I had a coffee with Wendy Chun, who is the chair of Modern Culture and Media, and I had just assumed the directorship here, and I invited her to consult with her group and propose a topic in global media that she and her group thought might be interesting to do at this venue. And because Wendy is such an intellectual dynamo and institutional citizen, within 2 weeks, I had, I think, an astonishing proposal for this particular event, which was amazingly well conceived, very timely, and showed a degree of intellectual and political commitment that is inspiring. So I just want to thank Wendy and everybody in MCM, for Modern Culture and Media Department, for coming up with this fabulous idea. As the participants already know, and as the attendees will soon discover, this is an inventive symposium, both in conception and format. It involves a collaborative archive that is on display on the first floor, and I will turn the mic over after I'm done with these remarks to Gabrielle Jung, who will explain a little bit about that archive. She's a graduate student in Modern Culture and Media and has done amazing work in bringing this archive to fruition as an actual archive downstairs. So there is one form of intellectual labor that is often completely invisible, and that is the conceptualization and questioning that takes place within a conference invitation. The participants already know the kind of work that went into the invitation and the kind of questions that they were asked to answer, but I'm actually just going to share with you part of that invitation so that you have a sense of what the conveners asked the participants to think about as they approached this particular event. So, like the title of the symposium itself, these are in question form. And I'm just going to read them. How is a refugee crisis defined, and with what implications? What are the roles of media, including print, photographic, cinematographic, televisual, digital, sound, and social media in the production and reproduction of refugee crises? How do media forms yield or impede certain knowledges of crises as the media define and rank crises and associate or dissociate instances from one another? How is this operated in different historical moments with different media flows and formations? How do media reports drive or obscure the movements of peoples? How is territory depicted legally, culturally, discursively, visually, as background to demographic shifts and relocations? Can the media challenge the responsibility and accountability of imperial powers for the production of refugees and stateless people? How? What is new, if anything, about this phenomenon? How are border policing and/or national hospitality figured as politically desirable, and under what mediator conditions? How do media forms themselves produce and police notions of nationality and borders? What is the relationship between the mediation and the materiality of population movement? How might media forms and flows be transformed, and how might this transform our understanding of and responses to flows of populations? What thinkers, theorists, authors, artists, or commentators provide the best critical insights into thinking about the constitutive effects of the discourse of refugee crisis? What media objects and text provide important examples to consider, and how are those best analyzed? So that was what was sent to everybody who was invited. I also just want to thank the conveners especially, and those are Ariella Azaleh, Bonnie Honig, and Lynn Joyrich. They've done an amazing job and demonstrated exemplary forms of collaboration and organizational responsibility. Wonderful thing. And I also want to thank the wonderful graduate assistant from Modern Culture and Media, Gabrielle, who will be speaking in just a moment. This is a widely supported event, and I just want to name the co-sponsors before I turn things over to Gabrielle. The Malcolm Forbes Center in Culture and Media Studies, the Department of Modern Culture and Media, the Department of History of Art and Architecture, the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, Italian Studies, History, Africana Studies, Middle East Studies, Comparative Literature, Political Science, the Swearer Center for Public Service, the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage, the Creative Arts Council, American Studies, and of course, last but certainly not least, the Kogut Center for the Humanities. Okay, I want to welcome everybody again and turn things over to Gabrielle.
Good morning. Welcome, and it was a great pleasure to meet some of you last night during the dinner. Also a great pleasure to meet you this morning. When I first was asked by Ariella if I'd like to join and work for Kogut and MCM for this exhibition, I was like, I don't know. I don't know so much about refugee crisis, but I learned so much from the materials, objects that the participants sent. Also, I would like to thank to my MCM colleagues who also participated to the wonderful exhibition as well. So putting this together, the committee wanted me to give it an archival feeling, how it collectively comes together and how they interact with each other. And one of the other tasks was facilitating the discussion. And when I gathered all the objects, there was so much variety in it. And then I started to think, oh, how am I supposed to bring these visually and conceptually together? I looked into the wonderful objects that you have sent, and altogether it seemed to me to go with a tent kind of looking booklet was a good idea. I hope you like it. I don't know. But please go down and look at them and come back to the table and have a great discussion. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Bonnie Honig, and I'm the chair of the first panel, to which we're now going to turn with dispatch. What I'm going to do is announce the 4 speakers and give you their bios so that we know who everyone is, and because we're not going to occupy the table until after, so everyone can see the screen. Each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes, except maybe our last one who needs a little extra time to screen some film for us. And so we should be finished in about a half an hour and then have about an hour for question and answer and discussion. And really the idea of the workshop of doing it this way with very short presentations was both to make it more inviting to people so that they could be sort of on their feet in thinking mode for for the presentations, but also to allow us to work collaboratively in a question and answer session that isn't abbreviated as they so often are in other kinds of conference meetings. Okay, so for our panel this morning, we have 4 people. The first is Tom Keenan, who is Director of the Human Rights Project and Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Bard College. He's the author of the books Fables of Responsibility and Mengele's Skull, the second with Eyal Weitzman, and of articles in PMLA, South Atlantic Quarterly, The New York Times, Wired, Aperture, and Cabinet. He's editor of The Ends of the Museum and co-editor with Wendy Chun and Anna Fisher of New Media, Old Media, now in its 2nd edition. He's also the curator of exhibits such as Anti-Photojournalism with Carlos Guerra in 2010 and Aid and Abet in 2011. He's a board member of the Journal of Human Rights, Grey Room, and the Scholars at Risk Network. Second speaker today will be Sarah Tobin, the Associate Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown. She is an anthropologist, and her work explores transformations in religious and economic life, identity construction, and personal piety at the intersections of gender, Islamic authority, and normative Islam, public ethics, and Islamic authenticity. She's also started new research into these areas with Syrian refugees in Jordanian camps of Zaatari, Azraq, and Cyber City. She's the author of Everyday Piety, Islam and Economy in Jordan, out with Cornell University Press. Next, we'll have Itamar Mann, who is the National Security Law Fellow and Adjunct Professor of Law at the Center on National Security and the Law at Georgetown Law Center. His research interests include international law, national security law, immigration, and legal theory. Previously, he worked in human rights and criminal defense litigation in his home country, Israel, and reported on the violation of migrant rights in Southeast Europe for Human Rights Watch. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Humanity at Sea, Maritime Migration and the Foundations of International Law. That's with Cambridge University Press. And finally, Nicola Perugini is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow here at Brown in Italian Studies and Middle East Studies. His research is on the relationship between human rights and domination in Palestine, Israel. He's the co-author with Neve Gordon of the book, The Human Right to Dominate. He's also published articles on law and spatial practices, embedded anthropology, asylum seekers, humanitarianism, politics of the gaze, and trauma and settler colonialism in several journals and edited volumes. So we'll hear them in that order, and we'll begin with Tom Keenan.
So let me start by thanking everyone, especially Gabrielle, who did some amazing things here. It's a pleasure to be here with a lot of old friends. I'm going to just read you a very short part of a work in progress, which may be a foolhardy attempt at amateur secondhand history writing. So I'm warning you. But it was sparked by a throwaway line in an article by Michael Ignatieff in the New York Review of Books about the refugee crisis. And he says the following: fear makes for bad strategy. A better policy starts by remembering a better America. In January 1957, none other than Elvis Presley sang a gospel tune called There Will Be Peace in the Valley on the Ed Sullivan Show to encourage Americans to welcome and donate to Hungarian refugees. Then he gives a couple more examples, and then he said, which are Vietnamese boat people and Kosovar refugees in '99, and he says, these examples show what can be done if the president authorizes rapid refugee clearance in U.S. military installations, and if the U.S. were to process and repatriate refugees directly from the frontline states of Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. So all of that seems like sound and friendly advice, but I was struck by Elvis Presley. Like, what's going on here? So that's when I went to my history books. So here's my little story. In June of 1956, the New York Times reported, and it had been kept secret and then it was leaked, on Nikita Khrushchev's epochal break in his February address to the 20th Party Congress with a denunciation of the repression of the Stalinist period, so the famous Khrushchev speech. 4 months later, in late October, Hungarian students took to the streets of Budapest, and their protests spread quickly across the country, and within little more than a week, succeeded in bringing about the fall of the regime and negotiation with the Soviet Union for the withdrawal of its Warsaw Pact forces in a week. Within another week, Soviet leaders rethought and launched a major military intervention and crushed the uprising within a third week. But the borders stayed open for much longer, and in the period between October 1956 and January 1957, roughly 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, most of them to Austria. A small group went to Yugoslavia. Nearly 40,000 of them, 38,000 and something or other, ultimately came to the United States, more than to any other country, where they were, in the words of one study, quote, easily the most popular group of refugees in American history, which is a funny competition. But as historian Stephen Ross Porter has argued, quote, the U.S. response to the Hungarian crisis of 1956 was the country's defining international humanitarian aid initiative during the height of the Cold War. So just in parentheses, I never even knew about this. I mean, I've worked on humanitarianism and human rights for a long time, and maybe I was just not paying attention. But I thought this was really striking, this massive influx and the character of the response. So that's why I wanted to explore it. The story of the welcome involves a mixture of elements that will seem familiar today. I'm just going to summarize them in a series of little bullet points, drawing on the considerable scholarship about these events. So one would be near real-time television coverage of the revolt. We're talking 1956 and 1957, but nevertheless, as one pair of historians write, during the height of the uprising, the American television audience had been provided with same-day coverage of students hurling paving stones and Molotov cocktails at Soviet tanks. Or as another one writes, for 2 weeks, the story of the revolution and the bravery and fate of the resistance fighters led the news. Okay, so real-time, near real-time TV coverage. Second, the substitution of a humanitarian response for a military or an effective political one. American propaganda and a very small covert action program had encouraged the uprising, and there were some smuggled weapons involved in the uprising, but very few. But President Eisenhower refused to follow through with more substantial support after it began. And the U.S. government found itself, again in the words of these scholars, Gil Loescher and Scanlon, quote, providing refugee relief in lieu of the military aid that had been withheld. Okay, so that's also a familiar scenario. Third, a coordinated governmental and non-governmental partnership in providing this relief aid. This involved, first, the opening of a major loophole in the otherwise strict and restrictive U.S. immigration regulations, allowing, quote, the Attorney General to admit or parole an alien into the U.S. on an emergency basis if the admission served the public interest. So that one. So there was a little loophole in the law which Eisenhower opened using this public interest, emergency public interest criterion. And a spectacular fast-track clearance program, which meant, as a historian, a guy named Bontempo writes, getting a Hungarian from the queue in Austria to an airplane bound for the United States took 4 days. So first that, legislative or regulatory tinkering and an extremely efficient intake operation. And second, a concerted private and NGO-led effort to resettle refugees. Much of the massive reception center at what was called Camp Kilmer in New Jersey was, Loescher and Scanlon report, quote, staffed by volunteers, and they had virtually no difficulty finding sponsors of job opportunities for the migrants entrusted to their care. The entire program, 40,000 people, was almost completed in 90 days. Porter notes, the other historian, that, quote, the private agencies licensed by the Federal Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid raised approximately $20 million in that period from their fundraising appeals, in 1956 dollars. Fourth, the emergence of a self-understanding among NGOs that, regardless of the spirit and cooperation and their obvious instrumentalization in the Cold War struggle, which they had no problem with, theirs was not simply, or even much at all, a political effort. As Porter writes, in spite of the U.S. government's investment in refugee relief, quote, what U.S. officials were discovering was that maturing right alongside the state as a provider of aid had been the private agency's organizational sophistication and the accompanying confidence that, while they might need to acquiesce to certain government oversight, the field of humanitarian aid should ultimately be the domain of ethically based non-governmental entities, not states. Okay? Something that is by now well an axiom of independent humanitarian aid. And finally, fifth, in response to the inevitable isolationist backlash against the sudden influx of large numbers of refugees, the U.S. government secured the services of both the Advertising Council, which anyone who grew up in America knows as the sponsor of public service announcements on television, and a leading public relations firm called Communication Counselors, Inc., to convert sympathy for the rebellion and antipathy towards communism into a positive image for Hungarian migrants. Or, as the CCI put it in a really lovely phrase, creating, quote, a great national desire to welcome and care for these refugees, unquote. As Bontempo writes, the Eisenhower administration and the voluntary agencies charged with refugee resettlement understood the need to blunt the isolationist criticism. In response, they undertook a concerted effort to sell the Hungarian refugees to the general public as prospective citizens with all the qualities that good Americans supposedly possessed in the late 1950s. So the amazing story of this PR campaign is really what I should be writing a whole paper about, but I didn't. So here's a couple of images just to indicate some of the elements of this. Time Magazine Man of the Year, the Hungarian freedom fighter. Okay, that's January 7th, so that came out at the very end of 1956. A campaign to send disc jockeys to Austria, 10 members of the National Council of Disc Jockeys. Who knew that such a thing existed? National Council of Disc Jockeys for Public Service departed yesterday by plane for Austria. They plan to interview Hungarian refugees there using tape and film. Okay. Organized by CARE. All right. That was that. And then, and this guy is really extraordinary, Leo Czerny, who was the head of the International Rescue Committee, which had grown out of efforts to rescue European Jewry in the Second World War. They ran a kind of underground railroad out of the Second World War. And afterwards were a sort of struggling NGO. And Czerny was an extremely dynamic public personality and pretty much single-handedly organized the private rescue operations. He flew within a couple of days of the uprising to the Austrian border and had managed to get Pfizer to give him $200,000 worth of leftover penicillin, which he took in the back of a as they say, this thing is incredibly well documented. In the back of a beat-up 1946 Chevrolet, he drove from Austria into Budapest in the middle of the rebellion. Okay, and then later came back, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But that's him with the flag that he took to and from Hungary. So the amazing story deserves a much longer retelling. Here's a few images, but I'll conclude where I began. The fall and winter of 1956 and 57 were not only notable for the Hungarian rebellion, but also for the explosion in American media of the extraordinary phenomenon that was Elvis Presley and his celebrated appearances on the most popular live television program of the time, The Ed Sullivan Show. Elvis performed 3 times in September, October, and January, and those appearances catapulted him into superstardom. At the end of Presley's second appearance, on the 28th of October, 5 days after the uprising began, Sullivan had himself called attention to, and I'm quoting him, the plight of the Hungarian people who have putting out this magnificent fight against the commies over there, unquote. And a week later, just back from Austria and Budapest on the 4th of November, Sullivan had showcased an emergency appeal from his live audience by Leo Charney. Charney came back and scouted around, and there was only one place that you could spontaneously appear on live American television. Before, it was like a 50 million people audience, and it was Ed Sullivan. So he got a seat in the auditorium and had Sullivan call on him. And he spoke for a full 4 minutes with the flag, with that flag that that I just showed you. Spoke for a full 4 minutes, quote, to tell the story of Hungary's glory and need. Showed the shredded and soiled flag with the hastily improvised Red Cross. And Sullivan closed with an appeal for financial support for the IRC, asking viewers to send in $1 apiece. The appeal generated $455,000 in donations, which apparently was unprecedented in television history. 2 months later, and this is my conclusion, with the public relations campaign well underway, refugees pouring into New Jersey and the guardians of moral purity up in arms about Presley's capacity to drive the teenage girls in his audience into a frenzy, he made his third and final appearance on Sullivan's show, this time famously filmed only from the waist up. Presley historian Susan Dahl sees the appearance as a decisive moment in the production of what she calls the other Elvis, centered around support for charities and humanitarian engagements. She writes, quote, the final appearance on the Sullivan program was perhaps Colonel Parker, Presley's manager's, attempt to showcase this burgeoning to Presley's image on a national scale. The final song he sang that night was the gospel classic Peace in the Valley, and it was dedicated to what Sullivan called, introducing it, Hungarian relief, including a call for donations to your various churches, Red Cross, etc. And before I show it, I just want to read you one testimony that I found on Elvis Presley is hugely popular in Hungary because of this moment. And there's a little Hungarian Elvis Presley website where I found the following testimonial from an American who was complaining that their clip that I'm about to show you didn't have subtitles. It's a shame that whoever did the subtitles did not take the time to research what was said. In 1956, when I was only 10, Hungarian relief was very big. Our school had a jar for you to donate what money we could, usually the change after you bought your lunch. The jar was sitting next to the cash register, so when you paid for your lunch, you would drop the change into the jar. I remember it well when Ed said Elvis was supporting Hungarian relief. Well, my lunch became a little lighter, so I would have more change to put in the jar. Yeah, I thought that was really astonishing. All right, so I'll show you Elvis Presley, and then maybe we can talk about this later.
Fernando Montel. And for the youngsters, the Don Brothers. Professor Backwards and the exciting ballet bass Biarritz and other stars.
Thank you, Arthur. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you probably know, after he leaves here tonight with Colonel Tom Parker, who's done such a magnificent job as his manager, Elvis Presley is out to Hollywood to do his new Paramount picture, Running Wild, for Hal Wallace. While he's out there, he's going to do a big Hungarian relief show. But because he feels so keenly, this young man feels so keenly about Hungarian relief, he urges all of us through the country to remember that immediate aid is needed, so long before his benefit show is put on, he wants to remind you to send in your checks to your various churches, Red Cross, etc. And now he's going to sing a song. He feels that this is sort of in the mood that he'd like to create. Peace in the Valley. Here is Elvis Presley.
Till the Lord bright, and the Lamb is a light, and night is as black as the sea. Oh, yes, there will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh Lord, I pray there'll be no sadness, no sorrow, my Lord, no trouble I see. There will be peace in the valley for me,
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. While we're getting this set up, I'd like to extend my thanks to Amanda, to Bonnie, to Ariella, and to Gabrielle for all of your hard work organizing this wonderful event, and thank you all for the kind and gracious invitation to participate. I have been working with Syrian refugees for the last few years in my research. And so today, the image that I want to share with you and the thought I want to share with you is related to my own research and some images that I haven't seen really published outside of the things that I've seen with my own eyes, and I'm going to discuss the implications of that as well. So I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities. I took these two pictures during the summer of 2014 while I was touring an area called Rabah Sahan. And this is the Syrian Refugee Processing Center that resides in Jordan on the border with Syria. It is where approximately 600,000 Syrians came through in order to receive their official status as refugees. These specific envelopes that you're looking at reside within one room that's in this sort of maze complex of concrete buildings and mobile home units that the Syrian refugees would walk through and traverse, particularly at night, as they went through the refugee registration process with the Jordanian government and with UNHCR. During that process, their documents would be confiscated and taken from them. They would be held and they would be stored in these envelopes in this room. I really wish that I had better pictures to show you than just these two. I took these two with my cell phone, and I had to take them quietly because the colonel, the Jordanian official who was giving me the tour, was walking through this room, which is about a 10 by 12 sort of mobile home unit, smoking a cigarette, sort of casually glancing this way or that way at these documents that reside, and told me, no pictures, we're not talking much about this. And I'll talk about the implications of that in a minute. And so I took a couple, and he saw me take them, so it ended up okay. So these aren't totally surreptitious, but I'm not publishing them elsewhere for various reasons. But I found this moment to be a particularly important one. This Jordanian colonel is walking through this room, a 10 by 12 size room, smoking a cigarette casually and not caring at all about the importance of the documents that are residing in these envelopes. An entire family's documents are in a manila envelope, stored for months and months in this space. Think about it, all of the documents that would prove who you were, who you are, what you've accomplished, and where you hope to go. Birth certificates, death certificates, banknotes, ID cards, passports, your children's documents, your family's documents. During this process of registration, they would take all of them, put them in an envelope, slap a UNHCR number on them, assign that number to that Syrian family, so the family as a whole, and then they move on to the next room. And in that moment, I realized that if the Jordanian colonel had dropped the cigarette, if somebody had misplaced an envelope for a whole family, they could be lost forever. So this moment struck me as one of particularly important vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities at really significant and compounded levels, in fact. So in order to make sense of some of these particular vulnerabilities of this case and of this image, I actually found really good work done in the literature on chronic illness, surprisingly. And one of the things that I found in this literature is that the perceptions of future functioning, especially for engaging in one's own outcomes, and with a greater understanding of memory retainment, increases the likelihood for involvement in one's contemporary moment. In other words, the greater the time horizon, both into the past, as resides in one's memory, and one's sort of certified or acknowledged or concretized memories and understandings, and into the future with the possibilities that one feels like one can engage in, the more likely one is able to engage in the now and in the moment. And in this image, in these images, in this place, in this space, I found that the horizon itself becomes vulnerable. So not only people's sense of their memories and their possibilities for their future, but the kinds of documents that can concretize it, that can make it real somehow for them, for their families, for their descendants, also became vulnerable. So many of the certainties, of the assurances of who they are, reside within this paper manila envelope that could be lost with a drop of a cigarette. What I also found is that these kinds of images demonstrate a compounding vulnerability that extends into the political realm, and this gets back to the conversation that I had with the general, in ways that carry out into the public understanding and the political understanding of these spaces. One of the reasons he was saying, we're not publicizing this, we're trying to keep it quiet, is because these images look bad. They look bad for the Jordanian government, right? There are ideas and words and symbols that come to mind when you see this kind of image and when you tour this space, things like, this isn't modern, or it's wasteful, corruptible. And in that, the Jordanian colonel was telling me, hold on, we're changing the system, we're going to do something better that we can be proud of, that we can share with you. And in fact, if you do a search for this processing center, you won't find very many. I found one image published by UNHCR of this space, of these 600,000 people's documents. But instead, if you Google for images and look for images of the refugee processing as it exists now, what you find are things like biopower. You find the iris scanning system that's been put into place. You find that the refugees no longer have this number that they have to keep track of on a piece of paper, but a real plastic laminated ID card that they can use as currency and capital when they engage in everyday life, both within the camp and outside of the camp. And so as these documents were returned, and as the UN and the Jordanian government changed to this system of iris scanning and documentation that was modern, that was not corruptible, that was efficient, right, the opposite of what these images represent, what you find is that their publishing became much more widely found, more easily seen. And so this captures a moment in time and a particular kind of vulnerability that existed not only for the Syrians and for them, their histories, their futures, but also for the Jordanians as they grapple with the Syrian refugee crisis. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this very kind invitation. I've been following the work of many people who are sitting in this room for a while, both from close and from afar. It's very wonderful to be here. Not so long ago, Zacharias, an Eritrean asylum seeker and a graduate student living in Rockville, Maryland, was hired by a consultancy firm based in Hong Kong for a risk analysis job. The research the firm was to conduct was on migration from the Horn of Africa to Europe, and it was commissioned by the UK government. The Foreign Office sought to know whether travelers are aware of the perils of the journey. From his home in the DC area, Zacharias called migrants and refugees passing through Libya on their way from Eritrea. From their mobile devices, many answered. Apparently, they were happy to speak with him. Zacharias found that by and large, everyone knew of the risk of drowning, of the dangers of exploitation by smugglers and terrorist groups, and of the likelihood of abusive detention. Taking these risks, many explain, was still better than living in Eritrea under an authoritarian rule. One question Zacharias told me he wanted to ask but did not was, what about revolution? If you are willing to take such enormous risks, why not take the risks and revolt? But this, of course, is a question that he couldn't ask. It would be perceived as a kind of incitement, and it would probably make it much more likely that they would not agree to speak with him. And these are people that are basically from his same background. And on one level, the answer is very predictable. So under authoritarian rule, the means of communications are cut, surveillance is very heavy, and it's very, very difficult to organize. But I'd like to offer in this short talk a small hypothesis about another possible answer. This is a condensed version of a larger argument that I'm trying to make, and in this case, it's kind of oriented towards what I was asked to talk about, which is a little bit of reflection on media and images. So this different answer, supporting evidence of this different answer can be found quite close, but also quite far from the Libyan shores where the migrants who Zacharias wanted to speak with are located. One such location is the 1966 film by the Senegalese director Ousmane Sembène called Black Girl. Now, you may know this film, but I'll give a little synopsis of the storyline. In this film, Sembène tells the story of a young Senegalese woman who is hired by a French family and travels to their gorgeous house in the south of France to work as a maid. Using her salary, she purchases new clothes and jewelry. She's tempted by the world of material goods she's now exposed to. And when she visits her home country, she meets her fiancé, a young man that has become politically active in the context of anti-colonial and national liberation. Unhappy with his wife's materialism, and perhaps also unhappy with her newfound independence, he reprimands her line of work. Implicit in this reprimand is the same basic question: why not revolt? Ultimately, the fiancé's warnings, however, prove right. As she continues her work for her new employers, the protagonist begins to feel exploited and humiliated. The relationship deteriorates. She becomes sad and hopeless, and ultimately she commits suicide, cutting her own wrist with a kitchen knife in her employer's bathtub. Though she has been chastised by her fiancé for pandering to the French masters, one frame in particular exposes her own revolutionary role. The suicide scene unmistakably reenacts an iconic revolutionary image, a French image, the death of Marat, painted by Jean-Louis David, and this is just a reminder of an image that I assume people are familiar with. Now, the Black Girls' Revolution is about race, it is about class, about gender, and it's about colonial history. But it's also, importantly, about movement and a particular form of migration not perceived as part of the migration crisis. A single photo from a decade later makes the connection even more explicit. This photo appears in an album published in 1979 about the Vietnamese refugee crisis after the war. The picture shows a boy, bare-bodied, but for underwear and a necklace. The boy stands sternly in front of the camera. The frame measures his height from head to toes. The fact that the boy has only one arm immediately stands out in this image. And what is really interesting, I think, is the caption. The caption reads, "Liberation Day, April 30, 1975, freed one arm." The date in the caption is the date of the United States withdrawal from South Vietnam and the establishment of a new socialist regime. The book, by and large, depicts this regime as oppressive, and persecuting. It's written clearly, quite clearly, from the perspective of South Vietnamese people, the boat people that had fled later. But what is interesting is that is the kind of ambiguous status of this reference to the boy as a freedom fighter. The child is not depicted as a freedom fighter in the sense of having fought for the North. He is part of exactly this larger group of refugees that is fleeing from the North. And yet the same date, the 1975 date of April 30th, is perceived as the date of liberation, signaling a kind of double moment in which fleeing and revolution somehow become very related to each other. So I don't want to go any longer. We were asked for short talks, but these are my kind of reflections on the relationship between migration and revolution. And I think this relationship is systematically and kind of over a broad kind of period of the refugee revolution, the refugee crisis that we're now experienced. It's not kind of thought of and not systematic, not regarded by policymakers and people trying to make decisions, and I think it's part of a picture that we should think more about.
So, thank you, Ariella, Bonnie, Lynn, Gabrielle, Amanda, and everybody for having me in this symposium. I accepted your invitation with extreme pleasure because I think it is becoming extremely important and both epistemologically and politically crucial to problematize what is increasingly described as refugee crisis, the implications of this definition, what the notion of crisis obscures, and how it prevents us from appraising some of the most central political questions related to what we call crisis. So my brief contribution today will try to interrogate this problem of what the discourse on the crisis expunges by reflecting on the relationship between the media object I have chosen, which is a picture of asylum seekers who have sued their lips in a gesture of protest at the Macedonian border, political theory, and migrant refugee practices. What would happen if we understood the so-called crisis through the forms of resistance that migrants put in place against what is framed as crisis? Yes, because while migrating, and often by migrating, migrants enact acts, gestures, practices that we should apprehend, but we often fail to apprehend as resistance. Instead of thinking that the solution to the crisis consists simply in applying more compassionately our current humanitarian regimes of asylum, including the important but, alas, insufficient slogan, refugees welcome, I think we should look more carefully at migrants' practices of resilience. They might tell us something crucial, or something important at least. We might discover that the way in which humanitarian sovereignty per se functions, rather than its improvement or reform, constitutes the core of the question, the real contemporary crisis that calls for a radical reconsideration of our intellectual and political positions and actions. In light of this premise, how to understand this practice of sewing lips that has become so common among hundreds, if not thousands, of asylum seekers who have been sewing their lips in the last 15, 20 years while crossing or being stopped at borders, in detention centers, prisons, while waiting for being interrogated by the special national governmental commissions that the countries in which they ask for refuge created in order to administer and proceed their official asylum requests. At first glance, that of sewing one's lips might be conceived as an act of self-harm, a practice of resistance based on the self-infliction of a certain amount of cruelty, which, if radicalized, could lead to some form of self-destruction. In her beautiful book, Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, political theorist Banu Bargo has analyzed this practice of sewing lips, together with prolonged hunger striking, and other forms of self-harm among Turkish political prisoners protesting governmental repression. She argued that these practices should be understood as a new contemporary form of necropoliticization. The aim of these practices is not the amelioration of certain conditions. There is no clear request for the respect of specific rights in these practices. And what is ultimately in place in these forms of necropoliticization is a total rejection of and resistance to sovereign power through harm and, in certain cases, death. I think Bargo is right when she argues that when bodies become a weapon, the distinction between tools and ends becomes blurred. An entire liberal economy of the relationship between life, death, and rights is destabilized. In fact, sovereign governmental forces do not know, or hardly know, how to deal with the weaponization of bodies, with self-harming, with necropoliticization, and with sewing lips. Some anthropologists of migration analyze these practices of self-harming from a different angle. Their focus has been on how sewing lips or self-harming practices are culturally produced and can be attributed to specific social and cultural backgrounds. While this perspective of analysis might result interesting to some of us, I think it faces the serious risk of culturalism and cultural reductionism. For sure, every migrant or migrant group comes from a different cultural context in which self-harming practices might be ascribed a different cultural meaning. But why do so many people from different cultural contexts adopt the same practice when they face different forms of sovereign confinement and power? What does this commonality of practices mean? I think one important way to understand sewing lips in its full political significance is to understand what this specific practice of self-harming exposes of the current international humanitarian regime of asylum and its so-called crisis. In fact, we should apprehend the practice of sewing lips within the framework of an international mechanism of asylum whose ultimate legitimacy relies on making migrants and asylum seekers speak. Nowadays, in our sophisticated international system of allocation of humanitarian protection, the only way not to be expelled as a migrant unless one has a temporary permit to work is to pose as a refugee, have the luck to pass our borders, and fundamentally have a credible story of suffering to tell when being interrogated by our national authorities, which will then decide if the human being they have in front of them is a reliable refugee who told them the truth about his or her persecution, or a fake refugee who cannot prove his suffering and thus deserves to be deported. So following Bargo, we could say that sewing lips, without recurring to self-immolation, jeopardizes this economy of speech that constitutes the pillar of the international allocation of the right to asylum. Sewing lips attacks the foundations of this regime based on making them speak. It translates into practice the words of an Iranian poet, Mehmet al-Assad, who in one of his works entitled Asylum wrote, and I quote, "That which you are denying us, we should never have had to ask for. That which you are denying us, we should never have had to ask for." End quote. Migrants and refugees tell us that they don't want to be heard. They understand that humanitarian asylum is grounded in a relationship of physical and verbal power. They know that the question is not about reclaiming the right to be part of the asylum procedure and speak, since reclaiming that right itself might constitute a trap and lead to expulsion, in case the testimony and stories of suffering that migrants carry with them were not considered as enough tragic and serious, and thus deserving protection by state officials who interrogate them. Those who sew their lips do not want to enter the mechanism of asylum and its economy of selective compassion. Ultimately, what we call crisis is a tool of government of bodies framed as in excess by sovereign powers. Some migrants and asylum seekers know that, and know that making them speak and speaking when asked to speak about their suffering has become a way to administer a permanent sovereign threshold of crisis between migration, integration, and deportation. Therefore, sewing lips should be understood as part of a broader array of practices of rejection. It is not merely about rejecting biopolitics through necropoliticization or the politicization of death and suffering. It is about refusing of being made speak, of being identified. Like those migrants who, before arriving to Lampedusa or other European or Western centers of administration of so-called migrant flows, burn their fingertips in order not to be fingerprinted. Silence, sewing lips, is a refusal of being interpellated, whose ultimate result is to make a situation of crisis and its underlying political regime unmanageable, as the video about Afghan refugees in Indonesia, with which I conclude this short presentation, shows.
So if UNHCR did not approve our proposal, so we will not open our mouths. We will go on hunger strike till we die. And that is our rights, because UNHCR is a human rights foundation in the world, so they should pay attention to our requests. And we have great requests from UNHCR, and we have great hope from UNHCR that they should accept our proposal.
We will not reconsider the cases because they are on hunger strike. You are not a refugee because you are on hunger strike. You are a refugee because you are at risk of being persecuted in your country of origin. So we cannot determine refugee status on the basis of such a threat. You know, it's very difficult to predict how determined these people are. I personally find that it is extremely sad that they resort to this kind of pressure, because they are putting their own life and possibly the life of their family at risk.
thank you very much. Can I ask all 4 panelists to come to the front now so we'll have discussion? Are these on? Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yeah? You should just check it that your mics are on. Okay, so, well, thank you, all 4 of you, for really stimulating work. I guess I'll make an announcement just so people. I was very struck actually by your comment, Sarah, taken from the chronic illness literature about having being able to be in the now if you have a sense of the past and the future. So I'm going to tell you what time we're ending and what happens next, so then you can all be in the now. So the panel's going to go until 12:15, and then there is a lunch at 12:15. So we have, I think, a good hour for discussion, and we'll take questions initially serially, and we'll respond, but if we come to the end and there's still many questions, we'll take them collectively and have final responses from the panelists. So the floor is open for questions now. Yes, Aitan. Aitan, could you maybe approach the microphone? Good point.
So I'm going to propose maybe a different possible way to understand what's going on with lip stitching, and it's based on the video that you showed. It was really interesting to see that they actually delegated a representative who pushed for the proposal that they made, and prior to that, it seems as if there were actually rights claims that were being denied by the government, and they are now basically pushing those claims to be heard and reevaluated, and so I'm not quite sure whether they are actually outside the economy of speech. That, you were basically saying that asylum seekers are forced to speak, and they are basically, by stitching their lips, they are actually trying to basically resist that sovereign demand. But it seems as if one of the problems that we are seeing, especially now, it's not that they are forced to speak. They're not even allowed to speak most of the time. They are put in a detention center, sometimes in solitary confinement. And it can be months and months and months. There's no possibility of speaking, making your demands heard. The speech is just not going to be taken into account. And so I'm wondering whether there might be a different way to read about it, in the sense that it is a contestation of their radical exclusion from basically political arena, where they can make their rights claims being heard.
Yeah.
I mean, I had to generalize a little bit in the frame of the 7 minutes, and I understand what you mean. There is a question also of confinement, but then the next step is an economy of speech, of being made speak. And I mean, the functionary is clear. He's saying, if you don't speak, how can I verify? You are jeopardizing the functioning of the mechanism. The humanitarian operator doesn't know how to deal with that. And of course, the claim of refugees and migrants themselves might be more articulated than how I framed it. But then there is a moment in which humanitarian sovereignty is challenged. The fact that you don't know how to manage that situation tells something about how asylum is provided, how this mechanism functions. Of course, sometimes there is a basic denial of the right to speak, and so sewing lips and going on hunger strike is really about being heard. I don't know all the details of that case. But then it's striking that the answer from the humanitarian operator or the government official is an answer in which what is at stake is not really about confinement itself. There is something more going on. There is I was in Italy spending 5-6 months with asylum seekers formulating their requests, and I was part of this process in which they had to formulate a story of suffering which is believable, credible, and that's going to be accepted. And the whole point was of the functionaries, of the operators who were there, was to precisely how to push them. I was, as an anthropologist, I was in the center, so they were telling me, push them to organize their story, push them to organize a believable speech. So I was wondering constantly, of course, I became part of the mechanism because I was helping to build these credible stories, but I was wondering constantly how not to fall into this trap which might lead to deportation. And that question was not simply my question, it was their question. In some centers, they went on hunger strike and they sewed their lips in order to refuse the very idea of being interviewed. People were saying, why should I be interviewed? What is the myself, my body, is in itself an evidence of something. Why should I be interrogated? Why should I speak? Again, I don't deny that there might be a practice of sewing lips and going on hunger strike in order really to be heard and to exit this condition of confinement. But I'm interested in how this practice sometimes intertwined with the economy of speech of asylum.
Maybe I would just like to continue this, very interesting discussion. Maybe proposing a different terms instead of speech. Maybe if this is very much about confession, and confession in the way how Foucault is explaining how we live actually in a society that is based on confession, and how the mechanism of confession is also in relation to government, in relation to finding the truth. And how the whole system is somehow based on that. So therefore, this is an act of not being interviewed, and in that sense, this is so much expanding the society that many people would love to be interviewed, and our use, of social networks is exactly, a mechanism where we are not even questions, we actually are giving interviews constantly, and I guess that is maybe instead of speech, because if we say speech, I think I refer, this to a completely different understanding. But I think if we maybe use an idea of confession, then I think I will understand better which form of power relations. I would understand also better what kind of possible resistance could be in that act of not being interviewed, not to play that kind of role, that the old ecclesiastic system has been based on the idea of that kind of specific relations with people that have, being exposed to that sort of confession. So it's very simply that proposition that maybe I would like to make of thinking that power relations is based on the idea of confession rather than speech.
Taken.
Thank you all for your stimulating comments. I want to offer...
Excuse me, I'm so sorry, but maybe each questioner could say their name when they begin so that everyone knows who's talking. Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry to introduce that late.
Ian Strawn, Anthropology in Brown University Library. So I want to offer something that I think might help to tie at least many, if not all of your comments, and that's I'd like you to reflect on the notion of trust. I think, Thomas, with your talk about Elvis, right? There's this sense of we trust in Elvis as a celebrity to give us a sense of where our hearts and our charity should go. Sarah, in some ways, that notion of vulnerability is because of a lack of trust, right? That the system is going to protect these, very real material embodiments of one's identity. And Nicola, certainly there is this duality of trust between those who are the officials who want to have to verify the credibility of those stories versus those who are the refugees who are seeking asylum. Do they actually trust the system? And whether, in some ways, by holding back speech, there is an implicit, denial that, or an implicit sense that they lack the trust in the system, and even that may happen even after they've already started the speech process. I'm sorry, Tamara, I didn't come up with anything specific, but it still may relate to some of the things that you also presented. Thank you.
Does anyone want to say anything in response to that?
I take both comments. I mean,
Sorry,
we should articulate more confession, trust, and I mean, there is a constellation of concepts that.
You have to speak more into the mic.
Yeah. No, I was just saying I'm going to take the two comments as an important articulation of what we were discussing. I don't know if Tom.
He's taking these as friendly amendments, I think.
I'd like to respond just quickly by saying that one aspect of the case that I raised that I think intersects with trust in a really interesting way is the idea of memory and history. Like, how much can people trust their memory, and how much can they trust their history? And in some sense, these documents, your passport, birth certificate, the credentials of your professional life, schooling or trainings, they concretize a memory. They make a memory and solidify it in a way that could be lost as well. So there's multiple levels of trust, even of oneself, that the case that I demonstrated today, I think, also raises. So I like the idea of trust because it does operate at multiple levels, and even within a sphere onto itself. So thanks for that, Ian.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the story that I told was at least partly about the production of trust. Trust was not a given there. The aim of the campaign was to generate in all sorts of ways some kind of trusting reality there, and Elvis was a part of that. Can I just go back to Nicola's thing while I have the microphone? It felt to me that as you were talking, I was wondering what the difference between speaking and being made to speak was, because it seems like we're very comfortable with the notion that human rights claiming or humanitarian claiming is about having a voice and being heard in using the voice. And the absolute opposite of that would be, sort of in ethical and political terms, being made to speak. But it felt to me like the images you were showing were somehow operating on both sides of that distinction, or blurring that distinction, which seems like the absolutely most important thing not to blur. So they were saying with their lips, don't make me speak, and they were saying with their headbands, we need your help. And that raises a whole other question about what the difference between help and rights is, which is also an important distinction. And it was interesting that the headbands asked for help rather than for justice. But I wonder, like, how in that context can one tell the difference between the voicing of a claim and to use Alessandra's formulation, the extraction of a confession? Is there a strict distinction in this context? Because if there isn't, A, it's terrible, but B, there's something else going on there where a confession, an extracted confession, could also function as a claim or as a sovereign statement.
I think we should probably use, instead of trust, the category of suspicion. And then if one understands historically how asylum is evolving, and I think it's the worst case scenario that you are mentioning, because at the end of the day, analyzing it historically, you would notice that 20, 30 years ago, the mechanism through which one was believable was totally different and was not about an interrogation, an interpellation, the extraction of a confession. I mean, there is no other way of claiming rights that is not accepting that condition in many countries. You might speak or asked to speak in the moment in which you are really completely confined. So we go back to the first question, but then the ultimate nature of refuge and asylum is about responding to that kind of substantial, fundamental suspicion which is at the basis of the international understanding of migrations. I mean, take cases everywhere, and there is no claim without suspicion. There is no claim without the possibility to displace that suspicion. There is no human rights claim which is not a displacement of suspicion in the case of asylum. And in the case of... historically, it's about the transformation of the institution of asylum. And historically, it's also about how the category of refugee and asylum seeker intertwines with that of migrant. We cannot understand this emergence of suspicion without the fact that, without understanding that that distinction emerged because of specific administrative transformations of the institution of asylum, which is a radical transformation, which is scary, because asylum has become suspicion because of the needs to distinguish between migrants, refugees, and who is a bogus, who is a fake, who is telling the truth, who is not telling the truth. And it's interiorized. And then there are marginal practices in which this interiorization doesn't take place, or at least there is some kind of crack in that linearity. Sorry, too much.
Maybe very briefly. I will not take too much time for all
I'm
that.
keeping, well,
Yeah.
we like
Okay,
to have a
maybe
lot of time, and at the same time, I'm keeping a queue,
Yes,
just to let you know.
Sorry, because I thought it was...
I'll tell you who to call on next.
Very briefly, because in that, I think relation, I mean, in the confession, I think there is a relation between the state and the citizen. And I think on what, for example, the person that was in the video was saying, that in a way was emphasizing the threat that the person is escaping from. And I think in that confession, what is at stake is that the refugee is a threat for the state. I think that is a political relations that undermine the existence of the state. I don't think, I mean, it's a political problem rather than a speech problem for me.
And then we have Adi and Fanny. Oh, you're in the queue. I have you after Fanny. Is that okay? Or you have the mic. You have all the power to ask your question whenever you want. Okay, Suzanne.
So I'm Charles from Goldsmiths in London, and I wanted to come back to the provocation for further thought from Itamar concerning the relation between migration and revolution. And to start with an anecdote, in February, in summer 2012, we met survivors of a shipwreck that had occurred off the coast of Tunisia in February 2011. i.e., a group of, I forget exactly how many people had taken a boat from the small town of Zarzis in the south of Tunisia at the very beginning of February, i.e., only 1 month after the Tunisian people had toppled the Ben Ali regime. And in the coming months, in which more than close to 30,000 Tunisians seized the opportunity to cross over to Italy mainly between January and April 2011, a dominant question that seemed to haunt the European press was, why are you leaving? You just toppled your regime. Why aren't you rebuilding your own country? So after inquiring into the conditions of the shipwreck, we asked a bit provocatively to our interlocutor, well, why did you leave? Were you not betraying, as some were portraying it, the revolution you had just contributed to? And he said, listen, I was in Zarzis and participated in the demonstrations that led to toppling the regime. And leaving just after, I was not betraying the revolution. I was exercising another dimension of the freedom we had just fought for, i.e., Tunisians, I believe, stood up against a state that was denying them the most basic freedoms and conditions of well-being. And that denial operated not only within the boundaries of that state, but was also exercised by the Tunisian regime, denying its own citizens, through its cooperation with the EU, the right to cross its borders and seek a better life elsewhere. So this anecdote, simply to maybe emphasize and concur with your proposal that we need to think this relation further, right? I think often we tend to think, migration, revolution, or in older terms, exit and voice, right? In binary terms, and somehow presupposing that the proper space of politics is that bounded by the nation state, right? And occluding in that the space of politics that exists on a transnational scale. So we need to think, I think, of the struggles surrounding migration as struggles around the way we are governed beyond the scale of the nation state. And in thinking this, I think there's been a tremendous work by political scientists on political repertoires, etc., at the level of states. But we need to think of the repertoires of political action enacted by migrants on this transnational scale. And I think that the sewing of lips, for example, is certainly one. And it's also no surprise that very often migrants, asylum seekers, are less addressing states than UN, international NGO institutions, which are very often the very institutions towards which they are, directly confronted with and governed by.
So if I can just quickly respond to that. So everything is exactly on point, and indeed, these reflections were triggered initially precisely in that period of time after the revolution in Tunisia and in Egypt, when things looked good. And I was at the time with Human Rights Watch on the Greek-Turkish border. I met with Tunisian revolutions who told me things that are similar to what you heard, namely, we are claiming our rights in the same way that the revolution has claimed rights, or in another way, but the underlying action is somehow very deeply linked. And I just want to tie this kind of observation and argument to my own academic discipline, which is international law. So the basic doctrine in international law is that human rights are granted to people by states So humans that are under the jurisdiction of a particular state have a claim towards that state. The jurisdiction is territorial, that it can be personal, but it's still bound to a state, and when a state is not adhering to its obligations, to its duties, it's in violation of human rights. And so the individual doesn't have claims that are direct towards the transnational sphere or towards international law, so to speak. And the argument that I kind of presented here in a short version is part of a larger argument that tries to make the claim that individuals do indeed make direct claims upon the transnational or international sphere for their rights, and they can do this by revolution and by kind of constituting the forum in which state rights are granted, namely states, but they also can do this by movement, where they actually they use their bodies in order to make claims that are not mediated by states. This is tied to a certain intellectual history of human rights, whereby rights and states in the 1990s especially were decoupled by many theorists that emphasize civil society groups rather than individuals making claims directly in this way. So it's trying to radicalize that same line of thought and line of argument. It relates a little bit to what we just discussed with regard to lip sewing, but maybe with the interest of time we can defer that to later and hear some more people.
Can I just add one thing? So the Hungarian example was also a direct correlation between rebellion and flight. And what I found extremely interesting, and it's emblematized by that Time magazine cover, was the massive and intentional conflation of freedom, the freedom exercised in revolution and the freedom exercised in leaving. So the whole idea was, and I mean the number of freedom fighters in the legit sense of the word was tiny in Hungary. But 200,000 refugees got blessed with the nickname freedom fighter in that operation. So the category just slid with them by virtue of the notion that that departure was a further step in rebellion.
Can I add something very quickly on the state? I think in certain situations, at least in Italy, the state and the UN in a way overlap. I mean, the kind of commissions in which these migrants apply for asylum have a UN representative and the state. So how is it really possible to separate nowadays the two spaces and understand clearly where are we aiming at, or what are they aiming at when there is a claim? I'm not sure about that distinction between the international regime and states.
Thank you. Next question is Ari.
And just a quick remark on the question of revolution and migration, and then I have a question. Maybe we can take this just one step forward and say that large enough migration is a form of regime change by its own, or it can be imagined as a form of regime change. Mm-hmm. It's maybe the best form of regime change, just evacuating a terrible state from its citizens to the repertoire of possible imaginative practices. Now, I was struck by a contrast between what Tom told us and what Nicola told us. In Nicola's story, there is a group of people who are blocked from entering, but they already have asylum. They are in some kind of a limbo space in which, for a while, they are granted asylum. In Tom's case, there is no need for this limbo space. Very unusual case in which the limbo space actually doesn't exist. But there's also another type of state or situation in which there is no limbo space either, where the states are sealed from immigration in a very clear way. Like Israel has a border with Syria, There's no refugees on the border. We haven't heard about refugees on the borders of Russia or of some other states. I think it's interesting to know that there are boats, refugees on boats going to Greece, but not to the island, the British Isles, right? Another island. We could reach this island by boat, but there's hardly any boats going there. So I think we should think about a map of a different map of states and continents, actually, according to the dispersions and distributions of limbo spaces that are the spaces that actually allow the immigration. These are the spaces that allow the movement. Without them, there is no movement, as we see in the cases that I mentioned before. So I think that we should think about these spaces not only from the point of view of the rights, the way the rights are granted or deprived, and the security apparatus and all this. I mean, everything you said is absolutely true, of course. But it is also, there is also this other side, that without them, there will be nothing. There will be no movement at all.
Responses?
Can I just add a kind of third space, maybe, to this idea? Addie, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, especially in these last comments, that spaces that allow movement make movement in some ways. Actually, there is a very interesting case on the Syrian border in Israel, where Israel has taken in Syrian freedom fighters or various groups and has treated them and then sent them back. And so it's not a space for movement, but it is seen as a space for like temporary respite, for healing, for, I mean, and most Syrians would never say that they'd ever see the day where Israel would be a space for sort of healing and this kind of physical healing. And so you're right that there isn't this mass movement of people to the Israeli border for those purposes, but there are these other spaces maybe that aren't a way through, but are a kind of bump in, which I think adds a different kind of pace or style, momentum to this flow of movement that you're talking about.
What is the advantage of thinking about limbos? What is the political advantage of thinking about limbos and those spaces as a potential crack?
Just because they are there, you have to understand how they function, or what is their meaning, not only from the point of view of not only from the humanitarian political.
But they're space of confinement, no?
There are also spaces, but there are also spaces of passage. They create. It's like creating a vacuum into which something can flow.
Fanny?
Thanks. I wanted to ask two questions, and the first is really an invitation for Bonnie to ask a question about the sewing. Because of your work on this, but I'm struck particularly in how the recent protests that are mouth-related, you could say, in refugee camps have been sewn instead of taped, whereas earlier in the crisis it was mostly duct tape. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, Nicola, if you could talk a little bit about how you understand the sewing and actually the images, particularly in that video, of people having to sew each other's lips as opposed to just putting on some duct tape, and what you think that means. My second question is about the performative elements in some of what was shown, and sort of the anti-performance maybe in what Sarah showed, almost the dead theater of all of the envelopes versus the Ed Sullivan show. And then also for Nicola, the most recent report that I heard about Mouths Sewn Shut was in the Calais camp, and the BBC did a story on the radio, at least, about interviewing someone, or sort of interviewing someone, where they said, with no hint of irony in the way that they do. The last time we spoke to this person, it was because he was the head of the theater troupe at the camp at Calais that performed Hamlet and Antigone. And they played a clip of the interview with him from, I think, about 9 months ago. They said, today we're holding a microphone up to him, but he won't speak because his mouth is sewn shut. And then they moved on to the American election. So I'm wondering sort of how you understand, Thomas and Nicola and the others too, how you understand these kind of performative spaces of getting up and trying to play something for others, or where you see those categories and what you're looking at.
I was going to say, this is a television question.
Closely related to exactly.
Yeah.
So my questions also had to do with the sort of performative aspect and the media aspect, what kinds of images are being created, and very much along the same lines. So one, I very interested in what you were saying about the shift from kind of duct tape to sewing. But I also think that there's an interesting, again, for Nicola, the kind of imagery that we see in also a lot of domestic protests of people being silent but like holding up a sign that says the words instead of them speaking it. So there seems to be this kind of performance of both silence and speech at the same moment, that you're not speaking but that you have a kind of image of the words there, which I think is somewhat similar to the sewing of the lips. So it seems like there's a particular kind of performative gesture in a number of protests, whether it's sewing lists or duct tapes or just having your mouth closed but holding up a sign, that I'm curious about. So that was one. But then I did also have another for Tom about television and Elvis, both as a television scholar, and I'm guessing probably the only person in the room who's actually written an article about Elvis. So one thing I would want to say about that is I think that in this case, one of the things so fascinating about that confluence is the way that Ed Sullivan and Elvis both kind of managed this sort of heartland America and otherness together. So I think it raises a lot of issues about, for example, race and ethnicity and the way that those are managed even internally, right? So, you know, Ed Sullivan being like German immigrant and throughout his, you know, seen as creating sort of the definition of heartland TV, but with constant jokes about his accent, that he couldn't really speak American, right? So that there was already this way in which he mediated the sort of American and the un-American. And Elvis, I think, in quite a different way, but the way that he was so much seen as mediating between, you know, sort of, or fully appropriating, depending on people's interpretation, black culture and white culture and you know, rural and urban, so that there were a way in which both Ed Sullivan and Elvis, and then especially Elvis on Ed Sullivan, sort of took otherness and domesticated it. That was sort of part of both of their celebrities. So I feel like that framework already is a way for marking how you're going to understand refugees, as how do we bring otherness into the heart of America, right, has so much to do with the media location in which that was already occurring. So I'm just wondering what you both, you know, these are two things, think about that. And again, I don't want to step on Fanny's questions too. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad there's a real Elvis scholar in the room. I would, one thing I wanted to talk about, but I didn't really get to figure it out sufficiently to talk about it responsibly, was the fact that it's a gospel song that that he performs, and a song about kind of the deliverance from suffering or from exile. That's what the piece in the valley is, the place to which you come and are welcomed or die, but die in the good sense. And that seems really important for that really complicated operation that he's doing of, as you say, well, I mean, Sullivan introduces it by saying, this is kind of the mood that he wants to set. And so the mood is one of finally reaching a destination successfully. But the fact that that he has to take the detour, which is coincident with lots of other stuff that Elvis was doing, through the African American spiritual tradition, seems really important. I don't know if you could have done that really with very many other songs in that context. So, because it's America, but it's not entirely America, or it's a different kind of America than the audience would be expecting. So, I think that is really an important dimension here. I'm not sure about there's got to be something important to say about performance, but I'm not sure what it is. About the signs, I think, so there are different ways of speaking, and you can speak by opening your mouth, or you can speak by appearing and claiming a visual space. And it seems to me that that's what the signs, that's what Nicola's video shows us, that all at one time, is the shutting down of the audio and the opening up of the video, as it were, of the visual. So talking through pictures, and now obviously in a social media moment, it's even more pronounced. People appearing in public bearing written inscriptions, which are destined for spaces in which audio is not the first resource available. It seems to me so if that's partly what performance means, it means taking advantage of all, or trying to take advantage of all the possible media of signification, then that's definitely an important dimension here.
I'll invite others to respond if they want to this question, but we're going to move to question gathering at this point after we're done with this part. So we'll collect a few questions and then ask everyone to say one final piece in response to those questions, because I still have several people in the queue, including myself, at the end. So does anyone else have something to say we've actually collected 2 questions inadvertently here already, so does anyone want to say anything in response to them?
Yeah, there was a question about tapes and suing. I don't know. I think there is something also which is an escalation in the forms that people can adopt in order to resist. And ensuing, self-harming means some kind of, means to be ready to pass some kind of threshold, which has to do with the integrity of the body. Then you could understand it through the classical paradigm, this is biopolitics and it's about the administration of bodies, so they understand biopolitics and they understand that the crucial thing is life, so let's use life itself and let's produce some kind of effect on the body that changes the status of that life. It's like with hunger striking, there is an escalation, there is a readiness to go in some direction, which is. But what is interesting is that then it incorporates the tape in a way. So it does something like the tape, but with something in addition, with a new level, a new layer. It does something like a silence or the refusal to speak in a certain condition. You say, I don't recognize this space and the political legitimacy of this space, so I don't speak. But then there is something more at stake there, which is the use of the body as a weapon, probably.
Right. I was just going to say, you end up getting pulled back to Bargu's book, which you wanted to move away from at exactly that point. So I think that's interesting, right? You had a critique of Bargu's book, which allowed you to specify how it wasn't reductively biopolitical. But if you pay attention to the sewn-ness of the lips in the way that you're being pressed to now, it seems to me you end up coming back to her argument. And so that this is an interesting quandary for you, I think, to think about.
I think we have to combine that with the understanding that that kind of regime is related to what Alessandro was calling suspicion and the extraction of a confession. I miss that kind of layer, that connection between the nature of the regime and the extraction of a confession and the act of speaking. And so, yeah, maybe I go back to Pargo, but I still want...
Okay.
I'd like to,
Yes, please do. I want to give you both an... Put the mics right up to your mouth.
Here.
I just want to say that we're unfortunately starting to exit the leisurely part of our discussion, and we need to move into the more kind of abbreviated part of our discussion. I don't mean that for you guys, but as we move forward from this part. So you two, if you have something to say.
I'll try to take that as advice also from
Oh, well, I didn't mean it for you.
So I just want to very quickly respond to several points. I think that I would take issue with the assumption that duct tape led to sewing. I think sewing is around for a long time, and that seems to be not exactly a correct assumption to make. That's just one thing. With regard to Adi's point, I'm totally kind of sympathetic to this idea that these spaces of limbo are also something that allows for movement or also for making claims, but I think we need to be a little bit careful here and a little bit detailed here. So a good example is Guantanamo Bay, the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay began as a migrant detention facility and then became, after 9/11, the facility for the imprisonment of detainees in the context of the initially so-called War on Terror. Is that a space of movement? Is it producing movement? I'm not so sure. The hotspots in various parts of Southern Europe right now are producing movement, but not necessarily movement to the direction that migrants might expect they are producing the movement. So people are being sent from there back to countries where they may be surprised to actually land in the end. So it's true that there are these moments in which confinement and claim making are generated in one space out of the need of states to proceduralize and bureaucratize these moments of having someone heard. But it's also clear that a lot of other things are happening there. And one last point with regard to the thread about lip sewing, and I think exactly right, Nicola, the important, and also to your point, Bonnie, the important thing here is to see it not only in the context of speech and voice, but also in the context of hunger and falling back on the body. So there's a double kind of, there's two poles here. One is the pole of speech that ultimately is, the claim to be part of a political community, of a public sphere, if you will, in which people are allowed to have their voice heard. But if the conditions of speech are not there, there's always the opportunity to fall back on the body as an instrument of making claims and as a weapon. And then the hunger and the exposure to potential death becomes a kind of what has been called moral blackmail, a way of generating the message that if you're not going to allow me to speak in conditions that are acceptable to me, I will simply die, and that will remain in the end the act of your killing.
Okay, so we're all accelerationists now. We're going to try and be a little speedier in our questions. And my cue is Suzanne, and then, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, and you in the back. And okay, so in that case, please tell me your name. Oh, and someone give this man a microphone. I'm sorry?
This lady has been waiting very long.
Oh, I've never seen your hand up. I'm sorry. Well, I'll put you in the queue, but let's go to this. This gentleman has also been waiting very long, I'm sorry to say. So,
Thank you. I'm Lorenzo Pezzani from Goldsmiths College. Well, actually, my comment was already mostly anticipated by Charles, in fact, which only shows the worrying degree at which our thinking has been overlapping over the past few years. But I just wanted maybe to perhaps to continue and reiterate what I think is a very important point that you have raised, Itamar, the idea of kind of questioning this relation between revolution and migration, because in fact the whole current crisis in the Mediterranean, at least, has been framed largely as the result of the failure of the revolution, of various revolutions brought about by the Arab Spring, right? And so I think this is like a narrative that needs to be challenged, or at least problematized very deeply. And so maybe another anecdote which I think shows that in a very interesting way, also related to Tunisians arriving in Europe, was that something that told a friend of mine who was interviewing Tunisians in Paris, which arrived after the revolution in 2011, who were telling her basically, so we arrive here and we speak with these humanitarian operators who tell us, look, we would like to help you, but our government don't listen to us as well. We have our problems as well. And so these guys were telling them, well, don't worry, my friend. We have toppled one of those most brutal regimes. We can help you to, topple your mild liberal democracy, right? And so again, I think this shows and goes in the direction of somehow, troubling this binary, right, and not understanding revolution as, or migration as an alternative to revolution, but rather somehow the continuation of revolution by other means.
Thank you. We're gonna collect. Okay, so hold your thought, and can you pass the microphone straight back to the back row, and then across over here to the woman in the back row.
Thank you all for very rich presentations. What I noticed in all of your papers, and what I especially appreciated, was you all seemed to challenge kind of the philanthropic or charitable notions of taking in refugees. You called it different terms, even modern sovereignty itself. I'm with you on that. In fact, I completely agree with you. I'm just thinking out loud. This is not a position, but I'm also considering the fact that there is some purchase to this modern sovereignty or state-based refugee asylum system. Particularly what I'm getting at is the fact that there are some countries who accept refugees, and more than any others in particular, and they are, I'm thinking of my colleague's comment, these neighboring countries in particular, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And then there are those that are not, that do not accept at all, and are in fact not even part of the conversation. And so there's an irony built in, is that all of the papers critiqued, and I appreciated that, because I think we should side with the powerless here in the equation. But we're ended up critiquing spaces of the countries that accept refugees. And then there are those that are left out of the picture. And so what I'm getting at is questioning, how do we fit in the role for appreciating, if you want to say, the fact that when some countries do accept. And what I'm saying is kind of not rewarding that, but recognizing that there is a decision made in that, if I'm making sense. And just to sum it up, in the ways that you compare how Turkey and Germany have been treated in the media, by the BBC or CNN, for example, in spite of the fact that Turkey has been accepting multiple more, it's been treated as a failure. And because Turkey's not doing their job, the rest of us are suffering. And then Germany's act is an act of generosity, of charity. So how do you balance that modern sovereignty and the problems of the state-based system, but the fact that there are decisions are made that should be maybe appreciated or recognized? And this is not an apology for any state, of course. Thank you.
Okay, so keep taking your notes, and I'll ask you all to respond at the end. Next question, please. Sorry, I couldn't see you, and I still can't, actually. Would you mind standing up?
Sorry, look it up.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Neelam. I'm at Newcastle University. I'm here as a visiting person. I had a question for Itamar. I was very interested in what you were saying about those two terms, migration and revolution, and I'm also very interested in the historical dimension of what you were suggesting, because this discussion revolved around contemporary understandings of those two terms. But especially with your mention of Sembène and Lanoir, and that moment of third worldism, of anti-colonial nationalism, where he is interrogating the fantasy or the myth or the sense of belonging to a nation state in a very different way, I would imagine, in the 60s from now. And so I was wondering, is that dilemma or that debate between against migration versus revolution, migration and revolution, migration because of revolution, is it a specific, does it change in the context of third worldism? Is that a forgotten moment in that discussion isn't the issue about return. Migrants tend to want to return. And third worldism was perhaps a moment of more optimism, of increased optimism about the possibility of return, of a belief in the nation state. It was obviously thinking of Algeria in that context and of the ways in which colonial migration happened to France during the Algerian War and what happened in terms of post-colonial migration. I guess my question was also whether current understandings, again, speaking very much as a layman, current understandings of the way we see the refugee crisis in the media recalls much more the Second World War than the moment of third worldism. Is that a forgotten moment to some extent? Thank you.
Okay. Now to Bashara Dumani.
Thank you. This is a form of a question mostly to Nicola. I'm wondering if one can read that video completely the opposite way, and that is, it was referred to by the people themselves and by the person who's supposed to process them, not as an issue of speech, but an issue of hunger strike, right? So,
as an issue of?
As a hunger strike. And so, how can we read that differently? That is to say, instead of thinking about resilience, resistance, and protest against what you call the humanitarian sovereignty, which I think sort of displaces this huge critique of the national sovereignty in a nation state onto a humanitarian structure which is meant to deal with the excesses of the nation state in many ways. Not as a challenge to that humanitarian sovereignty, but an insistence that it should be respected and it should be enforced. That is to say, they did not want to say we cannot speak or we refuse to speak, but rather we are going on a hunger strike so you can hear us, so we can speak. And they gave a representative to talk for them. They didn't want to escape surveillance or not be recorded, but in fact, they wanted to make sure that they are being noticed and recognized, and where they are located. Exactly. Hunger strikes often take place in prisons, such as in Palestine, for example, and the insistence is not often about wanting to escape any kind of resist, but to say that we want to be heard and seen. And we insist that normal humanitarian protocols for what a prison ought to be respected, and that the Israeli government is actually not living up to those expectations. So could it be read in a kind of the opposite way in this particular case, as a hunger strike as opposed to a refusal to speak?
Okay. I'm going to ask a last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Just for Tom, I wanted to suggest that xenophilia is a common American way of managing the using the nation of immigrants idea of managing racial division. And 1956 is a key year in the development of racial division. In terms of Brown v. Board comes to mind, but there are other things going on in that period as well, in terms of effective claims of racial equality being made in the public sphere. So I think that's, you've already started to talk a little bit about that, but I think thinking about that welcome as a moment of xenophilia, that's part of the ongoing history in the US of a punctuated terrain of xenophilia and xenophobia is very useful potentially for you. Also, a term that you used, campaign, is a term, when you were talking about the advertising campaign that was put together, is a term that unites war and advertising. Both of them have campaigns, as do elections. I'm sort of curious now about the genealogy of that term, actually. But it does it calls attention to the role that packaging plays in all of the talks, actually, that we heard today. Everyone is impressed into some sort of package. Everyone has a figure who's put into a certain package. The citation of the Marat painting, the documents in their envelopes, the need to tell your story that Nicola mentioned in a believable and persuasive way so that you fit the idea of what a real refugee counts as. So I'm just offering you that as a kind of conclusive figure to use to think a little bit about media and the specific forms of packaging that mediation introduces or demands. in each of your stories. And I want to thank you for all of them. It's been really fabulous to hear you, but we'll give each of you a couple of minutes to respond to whatever you want to, knowing you're going to continue over lunch to respond some more. So, should we go in order from Nicola down? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Bishara, I think the two things were combined, the lips and hunger strike in a way. So I don't want to refer to that specific video, but in many of the instances in which sewing lips and hunger strike are used in detention centers, at least from what I know in Italy, the question is about being freed completely. It's not really about being heard. I mean, those guys were heard, and the functionary was ready to hear them. The whole point was about hearing them and listening to their story. And according to what I know, the question is precisely to escape those limbos, those spaces of limbo Adi was referring to. For many of these people, the question is not about even remaining there and asking for asylum there. Not being heard is also a question of continuing to be free to move. Continuing to be free to move from Italy to somewhere else, because according to laws, if you apply for asylum in Italy, you can't move anymore, in a way. You have to apply in the first. So the question really is about being freed and escape totally in certain situations. Refusing, because refusing means the possibility to continue to escape and to prolong that. And the reference to, for me, what was astonishing is your reference to Palestine, because hunger striking in administrative detention is precisely about being freed. Or you free me, or I'll die. It's not about I want to talk to you. All the practices of the last years were about being totally freed. No, I don't want to speak to you, I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to negotiate with you. The only thing I can negotiate is total freedom. And that's where it obtained popular consent.
Thank you. Itamar?
Yeah. With regard to Lorenzo, so yeah, the anecdote is a very revealing and interesting one, and I think.
Can you move the mic closer?
Sorry, the anecdote is a very revealing and interesting one, and I think in general, part of what would be the issue in thinking about the whole refugee crisis now in the Mediterranean area as a kind of transnational revolution would indeed be to think about structural changes in Europe. So, European policymakers are now very concerned about the number of refugee and asylum seekers, migrants that are in their countries. They're concerned that these people are granting rights to family members and that they're sucking up the welfare state. All that is very, familiar. But there's also this kind of, and it's all cast in a kind of, in demographic terms. And recently the book by an Israeli scholar, Liav Orgad, came out talking about the right of majorities to protect their cultural rights in Europe. And so all that is really to illustrate that there is a political revolution happening in Europe. The right is able to articulate that much better than the left, or at least much better than human rights-oriented commentators. One other articulation is, for example, Georges Perec's famous or infamous novel, Submission, that came out right away after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, in which the new leader of France, a member of the Muslim party, is going to devise a new European Union on both sides of the Mediterranean, completely changing the identity and the idea of Europe. So that's something that's going on, and that from the perspective of human rights exclusively, we are not able to speak about, but conservatives, commentators are able to speak about. So just taking that a little further, I appreciate the comment from the back. I think that's, I just really think that's indeed part of the picture. As you, I think, acknowledge yourself, often this kind of rhetoric is a way of deflecting responsibility from Western and developed countries, but I still recognize, the value of what you're saying. And I found the comment about third worldism as a kind of forgotten moment extremely interesting and fruitful. I need to think about it more, but what I can say just as an initial kind of association is that things that we seem not to be talking a lot about now are, for example, the movement of African American leaders to Africa, back to Africa, such as Stokely Carmichael. To some extent, Martin Luther King was on board of this project for some period of time, as a kind of vision of building nations in those countries, and that seems to be not an option that exists now, precisely because many of the countries that have, the post-colonial countries have become persecuting countries in themselves, and to some extent, just satellite nations, largely controlled, as many have, claimed, by developed or Western or northern countries in the global north. So these are all issues that have to be thought about, and I think one way to think about them fruitfully is through the discourse generally about the relationship between migration and development. So there is this kind of policy-making framework in Europe as well as in the United States, very much linking migration policy to the idea that aid and job creation abroad is part of the way that we solve this problem, and what are the differences and similarities, but mainly the differences between that kind of moment and the moment in which the nation-building post-colonial moment that you pointed to. So these are just kind of preliminary thoughts, but happy to speak more.
Thank you. Sarah?
I'd like to respond to Faiz's question in sort of three different ways. So this question of, how do we appreciate the role that the countries are playing that are accepting refugees without perhaps valorizing them and without excluding from the discussion entirely those that don't contribute. And so the first response I have is a very pragmatic, empirical kind of answer, which is that Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan have all responded in very different ways. The case of Turkey has been this attempt, in fact, to valorize itself and using taxpayer dollars in an effort to respond and leveraging that for regional geopolitical stature. But in the case of Jordan and in other work that I'm developing, working on trying to publish, what I'm arguing is actually in the case of Jordan, there has been this step back and a contraction away from being a service provider to more of a security apparatus, and leaving the humanitarian aid provisions to UNHCR and to transnational entities as a way to, number one, deflect criticism, but also as a way to still maintain some good sort of global currency as a good actor. In one of the early democratic debates, I think it was Bernie, but it might have been someone else, said, I would, to address the Syrian refugee crisis, I would mobilize all of the area governments and get them to do more for us. And Hillary kind of pushed back, and she said, actually, no, these countries are doing so much. And it was later Ben Carson, after his visit to Jordan, he came out and he said, all the refugees should just stay in the Middle East, and the West should just give them more money. And so these kinds of politicized responses to this very dynamic that you raise, I think, does merit a deeper investigation into the contours of the way that individual governments have responded. The second response I would give actually ties to an earlier discussion that the panel has had that I've been feeling uncomfortability with, but having some trouble articulating, so bear with me. This language that Nicola and Thomas have used about sort of claiming rights against states and rebellion, this idea, Thomas, you said, freedom and leaving, even this Tunisian case that was raised, this kind of rhetoric of movement as such an overtly political and I mean, the use of freedom in this way, an act of freedom seeking, doesn't resonate with my experiences with Syrian refugees in Jordan so well. People aren't talking in these camps in Jordan about the political activity. you know, these mothers come in with their children and they say, if we would have stayed, we would have died. It's an act of desperation. It's an act of survival. It is not so immediately, at least. I mean, perhaps in the longer term, some of these rhetorics develop, but at least in these sort of immediate frameworks, it is, it's an act of sort of basic life. And to discuss it in these terms of claims against states is this kind of politicizing that just doesn't resonate with the experiences that I had. And that leads me to the third point, which is that I think this speaks to these larger limitations that exist in applying frameworks of certain refugee cases onto other refugee cases. That to say that this applies perhaps in this Tunisian case or perhaps in these, the Indonesian case, for example, doesn't necessarily apply in the same way when we're talking about these other cases. And so I think paying attention to the limitations of applying these frameworks, not only in a geospatial kind of way, but also temporally, thinking specifically about the case of Palestinian refugees, that 48, 67, and Palestinian refugees coming from Syria today might have some historical trajectories of similarities, but that to quickly apply similar frameworks will be limited. And I think paying attention to those limitations as well as the similarities will prove more fruitful ultimately.
Thank you, Tom.
This point reminds me, I wanted to talk a little bit, I contemplated as my media object today Foucault's beautiful speech from 1979 when he was inaugurating an international committee against piracy about Vietnamese boat people. And he begins by saying, one thing we're not going to talk about is the reasons why people have left their countries. We're just going to take it as a fact and start from there, rather than opening up a discussion about reasons. And I think it's always very dangerous for in exactly the way you're describing to, you run a big risk of amalgamation when you start comparing and and transferring reasons across cases. So the only thing in response to all of these questions that I would want to underline is what I was interested in the Hungarian example was the incredibly intense overlay of classic political reasoning onto humanitarianism, and the extremely tight integration of the humanitarian response and the raison d'etat. And various raisons d'etat. And I think, you know, there's been such a lot of scholarship on the connection or disconnection between humanitarianism and politics, on the apolitical character of humanitarianism or the non-apolitical character of humanitarianism. It just seemed to me like this was a fantastic, dense integration of so much politics and so many different kinds of politics, including domestic racial politics, that it felt like a gold mine for thinking about other humanitarian possibilities, which may not be so obvious today. And there, I think Adi's comments on the virtues, or at least the possibilities of the limbo spaces, which we've become so accustomed to criticizing, is really important. So.
Thank you. Would you all join me, please, in thanking our panelists for a really excellent beginning?